Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Demai chapter 4, Halacha 3 in the art scroll. We're on 36a3. This will be a two-part shiur. This is part 1. So we're going to be talking about Maaser and Demai. And I want to give you a little bit of history of what's going on first. Maaser, this is going to be a tithe that goes to poor people. This is mandated by the Torah. And in the Shemitah cycle in Israel, there's a 7-year cycle for growing. Normally, in the tithing, you're going to take out Maaser Sheni. However, in the 3rd and the 6th year of the Shemitah cycle, you take out Maaser Ani. The question that's going to be coming up is going to deal with the question of whether someone who's purchasing produce from an Am Haaretz during year number 3 or year number 6 has to designate a portion of Demai as Maaser Ani. Now, certainly, you have to do that for Maaser Sheni. Question is, what about Maaser Ani? And this, by the way, is designated after the Maaser Rishon and after the Maaser Rishon has the Trumas Maaser coming up. And this, by the way, has to be done in order. The Torah commands us to do tithes in order. So the question is, when we're getting this produce from the Am Haaretz, can we assume that the Maaser Ani was already separated by the Am Haaretz who sold us this or not? And the sages are basically going to be holding that the Am Haaretz is going to be suspect with regard to, just like they're suspect with regards to Maaser Rishon and Maaser Sheni, they're also going to be suspect with regards to Maaser Ani. And ultimately, somebody who's going to buy 3rd or 6th year Demai produce from the Am Haaretz has to, in addition to designating Maaser Rishon and separating out Trumas Maaser, has to designate Maaser Ani. Now, when you tithe the Maaser Ani of Demai, one does not need to give it to the poor person. Why? Because the poor person can't prove that the produce was not already tithed before the sale. And we have a rule in monetary law in Judaism that you can't take something away from somebody without proof. You'd have to be able to go to a court and prove it. And so because the poor person can't go and prove that this wasn't already tithed, the purchaser is going to be allowed to keep this and, by the way, even use it for his own consumption. By the way, Maaser Ani does not have sanctity. Maaser Sheni does have sanctity. Maaser Ani does not. And that's going to be a case where on the Maaser Ani, it's going to be allowed even for poor people because, again, this is not Doraita Tevel that's had ties taken out, and then the question is if this is definitely Tevel, and they can prove that this is definitely Tevel, then you could say okay, I could prove in a court that this had no ties taken out or had some ties taken out, and this portion that'd be left over would be for the poor person. Over here with Demai, you're buying it from an Am Haaretz, maybe he tithed it, and you can't prove what he did. So the question that's going to be coming up is, because you can keep this and use it yourself, is there going to be a need to physically separate Maaser Ani from the remaining produce? And could you just designate it by saying, okay, this part's Maaser Ani, and do you physically have to take it out? Another sub-theme that's coming up here, and why this is all relevant in the first place, is that Am Haaretzim are not scrupulous or careful with ties for Maaser Rishon and Maaser Sheni. And the reason, by the way, this comes up in Bavli Makot 17a, and the Gemara over there is saying that the Maaser Ani is not going to be prohibited for consumption by non-poor people, and the Am Haaretz at this time doesn't have any problem with separating it out to remove the Tevel prohibition and keeping it for himself. And then, the rightful due is to the poor person, but although the Am Haaretz is not going to be suspected of theft, they don't consider it theft to hold on to the Maaser Ani that they designated, because they perceive the tithe as still being in their possession until it's actually handed over to a poor person. So the Am Haaretz is going to be suspected to not do the tithes for Maaser Rishon, and the idea is going to be kind of like a conflict of interest. And why not separate out the Maaser Ani, because they can keep it. So the idea is that the Am Haaretz will separate out the Maaser Ani because they're going to keep it anyway. And they don't have to give it away, and so they're not going to perceive it as a financial loss. Where is this financial burden that comes in Maaser Sheni versus the Maaser Ani? In the Maaser Sheni, in Demai, there's not a 1/5 charge. Over in Maaser Sheni, that's going to be Doraita, there is a 1/5 charge to exchange it from the money back into another thing that you can eat. And you have to add 1/5 to it. It's actually going to be a calculation that adds 25%. The calculation we'll get into later, but call it 1/5, but it's really adding 25%. Anyway, Demai is different, and you're not going to add that charge because the Maaser Sheni that's D'Rabbanan doesn't have this same level of Kedusha. Now, one of the other differences is that Maaser Sheni does have Kedusha, and the Maaser Ani does not have Kedusha. And so you have to be careful about keeping it tahor. And one of the other things is that you have to transport it to Jerusalem and eat it there. That is going to be a burden. So even if you have Maaser Sheni of Demai, you're still going to make an effort to keep it tahor, and you still have to transport it and eat it in Jerusalem. And that is going to make a financial burden that you wouldn't have with Maaser Ani. You're just holding on to it and giving it to a poor person. And if you can't find, in the case of Demai, if you can't find a poor person, you don't have to find, you can just eat it yourself. So there's not going to be a conflict of interest. So the question is going to be on Demai, well, what do maybe they did take it out. Maybe if you're buying this produce, maybe they took it out because, it's not really like a loss, quote unquote, a loss like, Maaser Rishon. Maaser Rishon, you have to give it away to someone else. Over here on the Demai, they're going to keep it for themselves. And the question's going to be, did they tithe or not? On Maaser Sheni, again, there can be a loss. So maybe there's a conflict of interest on it. Maybe they didn't tithe it because, they might have a loss on money. But over here, there's no sanctity with Maaser Ani. And also on the Maaser Ani, certainly on Demai, you can just hold it and eat it yourself. So that's really the history of why we're worried about this in chapter 4, halacha 3. Mishnah starts off, it says, Rabbi Eliezer says one need not even designate by name Maaser Ani of Demai, but the sages say he must designate the Maaser Ani of Demai by name in order to remove the possible tevel prohibition from the produce, but he need not separate it physically from the rest of the produce since it remains his property and is permitted for his personal use. And that's kind of the key, right? Because, it's so easy to do. Like you just say like, oh, well, this portion in the north, this portion is going to be Maaser Ani of Demai, and I'm going by the sages, and I'm going to designate it because the sages say I have to, and therefore it doesn't have a tevel prohibition, but I'm not going to physically take it out, and the sages say I don't need to physically take it out, and anyway, it remains my property because the poor people can't prove that the person I purchased it from perhaps already tithed it. Perhaps he already tithed it and gave it to the poor person. Perhaps it's already had tithes removed. So you're allowed to keep it and use it for personal use. So the question that's going to really be coming up, and really what's very interesting in the sugya, it's going to be Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. Rabbi Eliezer is saying that not only is it unnecessary to physically separate Maaser Ani from Demai produce, but you don't even need to designate it by name. And just as one is not required to designate Truma Gedola of Demai for Am Haaretz, where there's going to be scrupulous to separate Trumas Gedola, because Am Haaretz is going to separate Truma Gedola, so you don't need to go through the whole thing. So to here, we don't need to designate Maaser Ani of Demai, because the Am Haaretz is also going to be careful to take out the Maaser Ani from the produce that grew during the third and the sixth year of the Shemitah cycle. So, in other words, Rabbi Eliezer is saying that when this produce is Demai, that it's so easy for the Am Haaretz to do, and it doesn't cost him anything. He doesn't need to physically do any work. He doesn't need to calculate anything. He just says, he doesn't even need to designate it. And basically, you're saying that it's likely that the Am Haaretz took it out because he can keep it and use it. And there's they're going to be under this impression that, well, first of all, it doesn't have sanctity. That's a true impression. But they're going to be under the impression that, they don't need to give it to a poor person, and it can be their property until a poor person comes and claims it. And because a poor person can't prove it in a court, they're not going to come and claim it, so they're just going to keep it. So it's like putting money from one pocket into your other pocket. It doesn't cost you anything. So it really doesn't mean much, and that's why they're going to say it. Now, the sages are going to say something a little different. They're going to hold that just as the Am Haaretz is going to be suspect with respect to Maaser Rishon and Maaser Sheni, this will be, by the way, in the first, second, fourth, and fifth year, they're also going to be suspect with Maaser Ani. So therefore, if you buy produce from the third or the sixth year, then the Demai produce from the Am Haaretz must, in addition to designating out the Maaser Rishon and separating out Trumas Maaser, you have to separate out the Maaser Ani. Now, when separating out the Maaser Ani of Demai, one is not required to give it to the poor person. Why? Because they can't prove that that it wasn't already tithed, and maybe the last guy who did it gave it to poor people. So that's why they're going to say that there's no need to physically separate out the Maaser Ani of Demai from the produce, and the owner of the produce is just going to designate it by name, and that's it. That's how the sages are going to hold. Now, we're going to get into a separate topic that is going to be discussed tomorrow, and that's going to be really interesting. So today we're really going to cover this, getting into Rabbi Eliezer's opinion and the status of Maaser Ani, and what we're going to get into tomorrow. It's going to be really interesting. The mission is going to go like this. Basically, the case is going to be where, so Maaser, the Trumas Maaser and Truma Gedola, and certainly Maaser Rishon, it's all going to belong to someone else. Maaser Rishon is going to belong to the tribe of Levim, and the Truma Maaser that gets separated out from that is going to belong to the Kohanim. Now, on a Shabbos, and since we've been covering what happens on Shabbos with all of this, on Shabbos, what happens if somebody's going to come and dine at your table? And, it's going to be somebody who's a Levi or somebody who's a Kohen. You're not allowed to give them tithes on a Shabbat. But the question is, are you going to be allowed to serve it to them? That's really going to be the issue. And the Mishnah is going to say, one who designated by name Trumas Maaser of Demai or Maaser Ani of definite tevel before Shabbat may not take them to give them to the Kohen or the poor person on the Shabbos. So, the case that's going to be coming up is also what happens if you have a poor person dining with you and you have some Maaser Ani of Demai or definite tevel that you actually separated before Shabbat. Now, you can't go over to their house and bring it to them, but what happens if they come and they eat there at your house? So the Mishnah continues. It says, if, however, a Kohen or a poor person was accustomed to eat with him on Shabbat, then he may come and eat their respective portions, provided that he informs them that he's serving them with tithes. So that's going to be, the host has to inform the Kohen or the poor person that he's feeding them the tithes to which they're entitled to, because if not, then it will be like he's using tithes for somebody's personal needs, which you're not allowed to do. So that's going to be the case. The Gemara is going to get into an interesting insight that's not going to be the halacha maisa, And it's going to talk about the sort of the, setting the stage for the dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and the sages about whether Demai has to be tithed for Maaser ani. And the Gemara says, Rabbi Bar Huna says in the name of Rav, that one who eats his produce when it is tevel and subject to Maaser ani, in other words, when all the tithes have been separated except for the Maaser ani, is liable to death at the hands of heaven. What Rav is saying, Rav's point, and by the way, this comes up in the Gemara in Makot, it also comes up in Sanhedrin, in the Bavli, and really the opinion over here that Rav has, you can find this in Bavli Sanhedrin 83a, the opinion goes like this. Rav is holding that, look, what is tevel? Tevel is something that has any tithes in it that belong to someone else that hasn't had it removed. And so who does the Maaser ani belong to? It belongs to the poor people. And that's fine. It may not have any kedusha, may not have any sanctity, but it's the property of someone else. And unless you rectify, according to Rav, the property out of this, that somebody belongs to someone else, you are eating tevel. Now, when all of this becomes doraita, that actually might be how the halacha goes. So when the tribes are settled in their place and what grows out of the ground now is going to be doraita and it's not going to be derabanan, a case to do the tithes, then that actually might be the halacha. But today, that's not the case. Today, the understanding is going to be, and the halacha l'maisa is going to be that if you have definite tevel and you don't take out the truma gedola and the trumas maaser that comes out of the maaser rishon to give to the kohen, you're eating tevel and you get death from heaven. So the Gemara knows that this is not the halacha by Rav, yet it's putting it there anyway. Why is it putting there anyway? Yerushalmi is very funny. It might be there because that might be the halacha to come in the future when the temple is rebuilt. Also, why is that? That could be because it's setting the stage to understand how serious it is to not separate out Maaser ani. So I understand that it became, the habit of people not to separate out Maaser ani of Demai, and certainly not to go find poor people and give it. But this is being brought perhaps by Rav to really sort of shock the person that, this is still very serious. Now, Scripture does hold that one who eats tevel is punishable with death at the hands of heaven. That's actually in the Torah. The Torah writes that. So Rav is basically teaching that tevel that has an unseparated portion, even Maaser ani, is still going to be treated stringently, just like tevel, which is going to be subject to truma. And by the way, even though the Maaser ani doesn't have any kedusha, and even though the truma does have kedusha, someone who's going to be eating it is going to be eating tevel, and they're going to be subject to the death at heaven. That's going to be the point. So now we're going to get into this Maloket Tanayim, and we're going to get into Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. And the Gemara says like this. It says, what is Rabbi Eliezer's reason for ruling that it is unnecessary to separate Maaser ani from Demai? Now keep in mind that the sages are saying that you have to, fine, you don't have to physically designate it, but you have to at least say that this over here is the Maaser ani. You don't need to, this is only on Demai, okay? This is when it's going to be Doraita tevel, you have to physically designate it and you have to physically remove it. But again, Demai could have already been sanctified. It could have already had rectified, could have already had the ties taken out and already given to poor people. You just don't know. So it's going to be like this. The Gemara says, since the Am Haaretz knows that eating tevel subject to Maaser ani is a sin forbidden on pain of death at the hands of heaven, he separates Maaser ani from the produce to its sale. So in other words, According to Rabbi Eliezer, we can safely assume that the Amma Aretz is going to separate the Maaser Ani from the produce because he's going to free it from any death-bearing sin of eating produce that is tevel with regards to Maaser Ani. Now, the fear of a severe penalty for eating tevel cannot be the Amma Aretz's sole thinking for separating out the Maaser Ani of the produce. And why would that be? Well, because, if that were the case, then he'd also be careful to separate out Maaser Rishon and Maaser Sheni. And since the produce, like Maaser, if you don't separate out Maaser Rishon, then inside of the produce you have Truma Gedola, which goes to the Goan. So we know that the Am Aretz is not careful about Maaser Rishon and Maaser Sheni. So why are they careful about the Maaser Ani and not the other ties? And again, the Am Aretz is going to be careful about the Maaser Ani because even though they're going to be lax on other commandments, they're not going to see this as like serious because they're going to be able to keep it. And that's going to be the issue. In other words, there's not really like a financial loss. Now, it's interesting that the Gemara is continuing with Rav's opinion. Rav's opinion is that someone who eats untithed produce, when it's, is going to still be like tevel. And if you didn't take out the Maaser Ani, it's still like tevel. And it looks like Rav is effectively holding like Rabbi Eliezer's opinion on it. So over here, the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, since the Am Aretz knows that eating tevel, that still, by the way, is going to be subject to the Maaser Ani, is a sin forbidden on the pain of death at the hands of heaven. He separates Maaser Ani from the produce before the sale. And the Gemara says, and what is the rabbi's reason for requiring one to designate Maaser Ani from Demai? And they're arguing that even without this, even if the Am Aretz could not be relied upon to separate Maaser Ani. In other words, that the Gemara says that the buyer would merely have to designate Maaser Ani by name and would not have to physically separate it and give it to the poor. So we can assume that the Am Aratzim do separate Maaser Ani, and it's going to be within reason to require the buyer of Demai to designate Maaser Ani so he doesn't get a financial loss for doing it. And that's ultimately going to be the point, right? The Vilna Goan says that Rabbi Eliezer's argument that the Am Aretz has presumably already tied the produce for Maaser Ani is because of his fear of death. And that's accepted even by the rabbis. Yet, nevertheless, they're going to require the buyer to tie Demai for the Maaser Ani because the overwhelming majority of the Am Aratzim are actually going to tie the Maaser Ani. And there are going to still be some individuals who won't do it, but under normal circumstances, we don't look at the minority, and we can assume that the majority is going to do it. So it's possible that a mere verbal designation does not entail any financial loss to the buyer. So we're going to require him to do it to free the produce of any possible prohibition and any possibility that might be, there for something very serious. This again is for Demai, and basically, it's very cheap for him to do it. There's not a physical loss of material when you're separating out the Maaser Rishon. You're taking out a piece of the produce that you can't sell. You have to give it away, and taking out the Maaser Ani and then keeping it. It's pretty cheap to do it. You're not taking a financial loss. So I want to bring up the Rambam's point on this because we were talking about Rav's point, and Rabbi Eliezer is certainly influencing what Rav's point is. Rambam, by the way, in Hilchos Machalos Asuros 10:19 is ruling that only someone who eats produce that is tevel from Truma Gedola or Trumas Maaser is subject to the death at hands of heaven. So, in other words, if you didn't take out the Truma Gedola, which is the first tithe, and then when you're supposed to take out the Maaser Rishon, you didn't take out the Trumas Maaser that comes out that's also given to the tribe of the Kohanim. There's 2 tithes that are given to the tribe of the Kohanim. If any one of those still remains in the pile, that person's going to be subject to death at the hands of heaven, and someone who is eating produce that is tevel of Maaser Ani is not going to be subject to death, just lashes. So you're still going to be punished for it. So don't get too happy. Now, this, of course, is contrary to Rav's statement in this Gemara that one who eats tevel of Maaser Ani is subject to death at the hands of heaven. And one more point, the Peas HaShulchan 14.8, which is a commentary on the Rambam, is saying about this that Rav's statement refers specifically to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, and Rav is teaching that Rabbi Eliezer's leniency in the Mishnah is coming from Rabbi Eliezer's opinion that someone who eats produce that is tevel for Maaser Ani is subject to death at the hands of heavens. Now, the rabbis are going to counter that tevel subject to Maaser Ani does not carry a death penalty. And the Pnei Moshe, by the way, is going to explain the Gemara in the same way. The Rambam is going to accept the opinion of the rabbis that tevel is going to be that subject to Maaser Ani does not carry the death penalty, and that's going to be the halacha l'maisa. But you still get lashes, and they're not pretty. So the Gemara is going to go to a related conversation about this, and it's going to say that it was taught in a Baraisa if they saw an Ama'aretz separating Maaser Sheni from his produce, and they do not know whether he separated Maaser Rishon as well, the law is as follows. So again, question is, okay, on first glance, maybe the guy took it out of order, or you see him separating out the Maaser Sheni, and he's being very specific about it. Can you assume that he also took out the tithe before, which is going to be the Maaser Rishon? So the Gemara says these are the words of Rabbi Eliezer, but the sages say one who is found trustworthy regarding Maaser Rishon is trustworthy also regarding Maaser Sheni. Now, the question is that going to go in reverse? Right? So if you're finding somebody who's separating out Maaser Sheni, can you trust them on Maaser Rishon? So Rabbi Eliezer says yes, and the sages are going to say no. Sages are going to say in this Gemara, one who is found trustworthy regarding Maaser Sheni is not trusted regarding Maaser Rishon. Why would that be? Well, perhaps the Ama'aretz, who's an Ama'aretz, separated it out of order. And so you can't be sure that he did it. Maybe it's not in order. And also, a one-time observation of the behavior of the Ama'aretz, says the Chazan Ish, is by no means a proof that he's always going to be careful on tithes for produce in the future. Very keen insight by the Chazan Ish. And the Brisa is really saying that an Ama'aretz who's observed separating one of the tithes from a specific quantity can be trusted to have separated the other tithes from the exact same produce. But you can't use that to as a tool for seeing his veracity in other cases. So that would fit, right? So if you saw him separating out the Maaser Rishon, which most Amoratzim are not doing, and then you didn't see him separate out Maaser Sheni, and he comes to sell you the produce, are you going to be able to trust him that Maaser Sheni was taken out? You are going to be able to trust him. However, if you only saw him taking out Maaser Sheni, are you going to be able to trust him that the Maaser Rishon was taken out? You're not. And also, as the Chazan Ish points out, this is only for the produce that you saw him separating, because maybe he's an Amaretz, maybe he got it wrong, or just didn't do it, or he was lax about it in other cases. So you can't take this as testimony. The Gemara is going to ask another question about Rabbi Eliezer's position. It's going to say, what is Rabbi Eliezer's reason for ruling that the Amma Aretz, who's found trustworthy regarding the Maaser Sheni, is presumed to have separated out the Maaser Rishon as well. And the Gemara is going to explain Rabbi Eliezer's positions like this. It's going to say it is because the Amma Aretz is not suspect to advance the separation of Maaser Sheni before Maaser Rishon. So there's a prohibition in the Torah that you're not allowed to separate out ties in order. And we can presume that if he's separating out the Maaser Sheni, he did it only after taking out the Maaser Rishon. He's saying that, yeah, okay, the Amoratzim, they're going to be lax on the performance of mitzvahs, but when they are doing a mitzvah, they're not going to do it out of order. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, or is it simply because we say that since he separated out Maaser Sheni, there's a legal presumption that he separated out Maaser Rishon as well. In other words, what this other possibility is saying is that when the Amma Aretz decides to actually do the tithes, that he's not going to make any distinction between the various types of tithes, and accordingly, says the Pnei Moshe, Rabbi Eliezer is maintaining that an Amma Aretz who's going to be observed separating any one of the tithes can be assumed to be careful regarding the separation of all the other tithes of this produce. Because, okay, normally he's lax, but he's going to be doing it. That's going to be what looks like a pretty lenient opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. And this, by the way, is going to be in contrast with the view of the sages. That's going to say that the Amma Aretz may choose to separate only the tithes whose separation do not involve a financial loss. And that really is the crux of all of what we've been talking about. When you're separating out the Maaser Ani of Demai, it's cheap to do. There's no financial loss on it. So, the question is, can you assume that he took it out when you're buying it? Or do you have to separate it out yourself? And even if you do have to separate it out yourself, you're not going to have a financial loss from doing it, so it's not really a big deal to do it. Now, when you're taking out the Maaser Sheni, there is a financial loss. The sages are basically saying that the Amoratzim, by and large, are lax and not careful, and they're only going to do tithes that don't involve a financial loss. And so, if there could be a financial loss, don't assume that they're going to do it. That's the idea. Now, the other way to look at Rabbi Eliezer's view is going to assume that the Amma Aretz doesn't make a distinction between the different types of tithes, and he's either going to disregard all of them or he's going to separate all of them. So the sages are saying, no, he's only going to separate out the ones that don't have a financial loss. Rabbi Eliezer is saying, no, if the guy already is separating out tithes, yes, normally they're lax, but if he went through and started separating out tithes, he's actually going to finish the process correctly. And the Gemara is going to argue that the approach is actually going to be contradicted by Rabbi Eliezer's own ruling and opinion in this Mishnah. So the Gemara says, we learned in the Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer says, one need not even designate by name the Maaser Ani of Demai, since we assume that the Amma Aretz is going to separate the Maaser Ani from the produce. And Rabbi Eliezer is mentioning only Maaser Ani as a tithe of which Demai is going to be exempt. And that's going to imply, says this Gemara, but Rabbi Eliezer agrees one must designate Maaser Sheni of Demai. And we do not assume that the Amma Aretz separates Maaser Sheni from their produce. So Rabbi Eliezer is holding that the Amma Aretz is going to do certain tithes and disregard other tithes. They're going to be happy to do Maaser Ani because there's not a financial loss for Demai, but they're not going to do Maaser Sheni of Demai. And that's looks like it's going to contradict what Rabbi Eliezer was just talking about, where you're seeing a case. Again, the case is going to be like this. If you see him separating out Maaser Sheni of Demai, can you assume that he separated out the Maaser Rishon, which comes before it? And again, the sages are going to say no. Rabbi Eliezer is going to say yes. So the Gemara is going to continue on this argument And it's going to say that according to Rabbi Eliezer, the Amma Aretz may choose to separate only Maaser Ni, but not Maaser Sheni. And then, they may separate out, they may choose to separate Maaser Sheni, but not Maaser Rishon. Now, why would they separate out Maaser Sheni, but not Maaser Rishon? And the answer would be that, well, at least the Maaser Sheni, you get to keep it. And you're going to use it in the future. And yeah, you're going to have a monetary loss on it if you were deeming it for money, but at least you're keeping some of it. And the Maaser Rishon, you just have to give away. Or that in the Maaser Rishon of Demai, you sell it to a Goan. And so you have to hold it, you have to store it until a Goan comes. Or you have to go find a Goan to go do it. So there's trouble to it. So the Gemara continues, it says, now even regarding Maaser Sheni, where the Amma Aretz's master, Hashem, does not have a benefit of gratitude, for one is not required to give it away to others, one who buys from the Amma Aretz must separate it. So then, regarding Maaser Rishon, where the Amma Aretz's master does have a benefit of gratitude, one is required to give at least part of it away. And so the Gemara is going to ask the question, is it not obvious that one who buys from the Amma Aretz has to separate it? In other words, it's going to go like this. There should be a concern that the Amma Aretz did not separate Maaser Rishon, even if he separates out the Maaser Sheni for the same produce. And Rabbi Eliezer is saying that one who is found trustworthy regarding Maaser Sheni is presumed to have separated out Maaser Rishon as well. And the reason is because once tithing, the Amma Aretz will not have changed the sequence, so he's going to do it in order. And he's going to separate out the Maaser. He's not going to separate out Maaser Sheni before separating out Maaser Rishon. In other words, once the Amma Aretz performs the mitzvah, he's going to do it correctly. And since it is prohibited to separate the tithes out of order, he's not going to separate it out of order. And that's going to be the idea. So even though the Amma Aretz is going to separate out Maaser Ni, and that's not going to create a legal presumption that he's also going to separate out Maaser Sheni in a different year, the Amma Aretz who is found separating out Maaser Sheni in a different year, is it going to be where he's going to create a legal presumption that he's separating out Maaser Rishon and that he's going to be giving it to a Goan? In other words, there's two things going on. First of all, if you're seeing him separating out Maaser Sheni, can you assume he's separating out Maaser Ni? Another question, if he's separating out Maaser Ni, can you assume in the other years he separates out Maaser Sheni? And then you have also over here, if he's separating out the Maaser Sheni, can you assume he's separating out the Maaser Rishon? Now, according to Rabbi Eliezer, yes, you can, because when the Amma Aretz who's lax is going to do it, he's saying, and he's giving a lot of benefit of doubt to the Amma Aretz, he's saying he's going to do it right, and he's going to go in order, and he's actually going to do it. And so you can rely on it. So one of the things here that's to consider is that Maaser Sheni is held onto by the owner after it's been separated. And there's a worry that the Amma Aretz might have failed to separate out this tithe. Now that's true, despite the fact that all Amma Aretzes can be trusted to tithe the Maaser Ni, according to Rabbi Eliezer, but the Amma Aretzes are going to be suspect. You do have to eat it in Jerusalem. You have to transport it. The Maaser Rishon, that has to be given away, and theoretically, that's forbidden for a non-Goan. And over here in the case of Demai, they're going to sell it. So the question is that is the Amma Aretz going to have more reason to refrain from separating out Maaser Rishon than Maaser Sheni? Because really, the Maaser Rishon is a real big loss. And the Maaser Sheni is a loss, but not as big. So the Baraisa is going to continue. It's going to say if an Amma Aretz is bought out for them Maaser Sheni from inside the house and says to them, it's been redeemed, he's believed. Now, he's believed on redeemed Maaser Sheni, which may be eaten even outside of Jerusalem without tithing. And we do not suspect that he's lying. And it's actually going to be simple untithed produce of the Am Haaretz. That's going to be a problem. So in the other cases, when you have simple untithed produce from the Am Haaretz, that's always going to be a question. But the case now is that the Am Haaretz comes and tells you, this is Maaser Sheni of Demai. So are you going to be able to believe him? You are. You are going to be able to believe him. And that's what my young son is trying to figure out. He's trying to work on this with us. And we get all the benefit for teaching him Torah. So the Gemara continues and says, but if he says, it has been redeemed by me, and if you do not trust me, then you may redeem it for yourselves, he's not believed. So this is kind of like a Migo issue. It's kind of like he's testifying against himself. We covered this with Migo a couple of halachas ago. And this testimony, says the Chazan Ish, implies that there's room for suspicion. And we do not rely on his testimony. So we can suspect the produce as never having had the Maaser Sheni taken out. And we would say that it's forbidden until all the tithes are separated. So it really is like a testimony against himself. So there's a nuance here. If he's saying, okay, this is Maaser Sheni of Demai, he's going to be believed. But if he's coming and saying, it's been redeemed by me, and if you don't trust me, you can redeem it yourselves, that's going to be something that makes it suspect. So the Baraisa is going to reflect on the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. This is what Rabbi Eliezer would imply. And Rabbi Eliezer would say, one who is trustworthy regarding Maaser Sheni is trustworthy regarding Maaser Rishon as well. But according to sages who hold that the fact that an Am Haaretz separated Maaser Sheni, it does not give any evidence that Maaser Rishon is as well. And we have to suspect that he did not separate out the Maaser Rishon from the produce. And again, part of the sage's point is that there's a big financial loss with taking out the Maaser Rishon. And the Am Haaretz is lax anyway, they're probably not going to do it. So if they're taking out Maaser Sheni, but not Maaser Rishon, well, they're going to keep the Maaser Sheni, and they're going to say, okay, I'll lose a little bit on it, but at least I took out something. And at least I get to use it, right? I'm going to use it in Jerusalem, and I'm going to use it to go for the holiday. And over there on the Maaser Rishon, they just have to give all of it away. And so the sages are going to say that just because he's saying that Maaser Sheni is there is not going to assume that this is, has been fully tithed. So who is this last Baraisa in the opinion of? That's going to be in the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer is saying that if the Am Haaretz is going to decide to do the tithes, he's going to really do it right, and he's going to do all of it. And therefore, if he's saying, okay, this is Maaser Sheni of Demai, you can believe him. And if he's going to say something kind of fishy that, if you don't believe me that these are done and this has been tithed, you could tithe it yourself, and that's going to make it already suspect, then you have to tithe it. That's going to be all the opinion of how Rabbi Eliezer would be looking at this, not the opinion of the sages. So the Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to contest it, and now we're going to get the opinion of the sages. So Rabbi Yosei is saying, actually, this Baraisa that we were talking about on the testimony is reflective of the opinion of all the Tanaim. In other words, the sages are going to agree with this as well, that, they're going to say that they treated this produce like supplemental Beurim of the Am Haaretz. Supplemental Beurim is going to go like this. So you tie off your first fruit with a ribbon, and that's going to be your Beurim. And let's say you want to beautify the mitzvah and you want to add lots of fruit to bring into Jerusalem. You're allowed to. and it's not going to be subject to Demai. That also has to be eaten in a state of purity, has to be eaten by the Kohanim, has to be brought to the altar, but you're allowed to add more fruit to make it nicer. Okay, that's supplemental Beurim. Consecrated produce is generally going to be exempt from the Demai obligation, and the grounds for this is going to be subject to a dispute on the Amorim. The Rabbi Hoshaya is going to explain that the reverence of the holy is on the Am Haaretz, and he's not going to give the Kohen something consecrated that's not been tithed. And Rabbi Yochanan is going to hold that, these types of sanctified produce are exempt, not only because they are assumed to have been tithed, but because the rabbis, for other reasons, do not amend the decree onto these items. Since supplemental Beurim is going to be consecrated, that it's also going to be exempt from Demai. That's going to be the point by Rabbi Yochanan. So it's like a different category, okay? Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to say, just as we learn in the Mishnah, the supplemental to the Beurim must be eaten in a state of Tahara and is exempt from Demai. So too, the produce eaten as Maaser Sheni before it's redeemed possesses the Maaser Sheni sanctity. It has to be eaten in Jerusalem in a state of Tahara. So the Gemara is going to actually reject Rabbi Yossi's opinion that the Brisa accords even with the pages, and it's going to stay with its original position that, no, this is really Rabbi Eliezer's position. It's not the sage's position. So Rabbi Hanania came and said in the name of Rabbi Issi, the Brisa is reflective only of the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer because the comparison to supplemental Beurim is not valid. Why would it not be valid? Because it's exempt, because it's consecrated. We're not talking about consecrated things that are given consecration. Rabbi Hanania is basically holding, says Rabbi Kanievsky, that although supplemental Beurim does not need to be tithed under the rabbinic enactment of Demai, the redeemed Maaser Sheni of the Am Haaretz is subject to the Demai obligation. And since the Maaser Sheni is currently divested of its sanctity, the purchaser is not exempt from having to tithe the produce of for the Maaser Rishon of Demai. The supplemental Beurim is going to be outside of this ruling on Demai, and we're dealing here with Maaser Sheni of Demai. And so if you're given Maaser Sheni of Demai, the guy comes and says, this is Maaser Sheni of Demai, you can't assume, according to the sages, that the Maaser Rishon is tithed, and you have to take out the Maaser Rishon. You have to assume that the Am Haaretz tithed it out of order, and also probably didn't take out the Maaser Rishon at all. And the halacha is going to go by the sages. And so that Brisa is of the opinion that the Amoratzim are lax, and they'll do it out of order, and they're uneducated about it, and you can't rely on it, and you can't trust it. That's the point. So it's really honing in on this idea of, how much financial loss that the Am Haaretz get. On the Maaser Ani, it's not much, so you can assume that he's taking out the Maaser Ani, but you still have to go out and tithe it because maybe the Am Haaretz didn't do it, but they're making it very lax. So they're saying that you can do it by a verbal designation without physically taking it out. And again, probably they took it out because it's very cheap for them to do it. The poor person can't come and claim it because he can't prove it. But nonetheless, it's the Am Haaretz, and maybe they're just so lax on it, maybe they didn't do it. But the odds are they probably did, but you can't be sure. And that's why the sages are saying like they are. In the case of the Maaser Sheni, there is a financial loss. And that's ultimately why the sages are saying that, you can't just assume that everything's been tithed. And not only that, a lot of the Am Haaretzes aren't even tithing the Maaser Sheni. That's going to be the point of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan's point is that the Truma Gedola is going to be assumed to be tithed, but not the other tithes. And the other idea about it is because of financial loss. There is a financial loss involved. And certainly, if the Am Haaretz is coming and claiming this is Maaser Sheni of Demai, he's not trusted on it because the Maaser Rishon is a total loss. He doesn't get any value back on it. And so you can assume that perhaps he took it out of order. Perhaps he just took out this tithe that he gets value out of, some value out of it, but the Maaser Rishon is a total one, so he skipped it altogether. And that's why we have to tithe everything. Have a great day.